When people think about the first European colonies in America, a few names always come up: England, Spain, France, maybe even the Netherlands. But very few know that the Swedish Empire was once the dominant power in Europe, much less built a colony and an extensive network of defensive communities in North America. This colony lasted almost 20 years. This colony built forts, traded with Native Americans, and helped shape the early development and expansion of the important Delaware Valley. This colony produced bountiful trade and flourished, especially in its early years. And, most surprisingly of all, a colony that left behind something Americans would rely upon and perfect in the centuries later: the log cabin. Throughout its short history, this colony would be a melting pot of Northern European societies and Native American tribes, a bastion for those seeking religious freedoms and to make their own mark on their new surroundings through agriculture, architecture, exploration, and trade. This is the story of New Sweden, one of the most forgotten chapters in early American colonial history. In the early 1600s, Sweden was not the quiet Scandinavian country we may think of today. Instead, it was an expanding empire. Under King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden rose to become the most powerful nation in Europe. Swedish armies dominated the battlefields of the 30 Years' War, and the country controlled large parts of the Baltic Sea while wielding massive trade influence. For the first time in history, a unified Sweden was universally feared. And while that may seem to have sate the common population, something was missing. Like many European powers of the time, Sweden hungered for more. Across the Atlantic, European nations were building colonies that produced enormous wealth. Spain controlled the vast empires of the South and North Americas. Their treasure galleons paraded the Caribbean, flaunting enormous wealth. England was busy establishing settlements along the eastern coast, and countless furs were being imported back to the European continent. The Dutch had founded New Amsterdam, which would later become New York, and finally had a trading hub in the New World in which all European nations respected. The French had even begun in earnest to explore the interior and chart the great expanses of land in preparation for mass colonization. But Sweden had nothing to show for their European domination in the New World, and both elites and the monarchy were demanding that action be taken. So, in the 1630s, Swedish merchants and government officials formed a new enterprise, the New Sweden Company. Their goal was simple: establish a profitable colony in North America. But this would be no easy task with competition from all major European powers already in North America. With a hefty lead already established by the other great European colonial powers, Sweden was playing catch-up. And not only catch-up, they were attempting to do so on a shoestring budget. Despite these challenges, Sweden sailed for the prestige of the New World. In 1637, two ships set sail from Sweden, the Kalmar Nyckel and the Fogel Grip. On board were soldiers, settlers, traders, government officials, and even some African slaves. Their leader was Peter Minuit. Minuit was a fascinating choice. Though he had a sterling reputation and worked as a diamond cutter and broker in the 1620s, he had famously worked for the Dutch in the years previous. He had been known for negotiating the purchase of Manhattan Island from Native Americans. Both trade and population grew rapidly under his leadership. But after disagreements with the Dutch West India Company, the German decided to enter Swedish service. Now he would help Sweden build its own colony in North America. After months crossing the Atlantic, the ships arrived in the Delaware River Valley in 1638. The settlers quickly began construction of a small fort. They would name it Fort Christina after the young Swedish queen. Today, that location sits inside the modern city of Wilmington, Delaware. This small settlement would become the center of Sweden's American colony. Unfortunately, Minute's life would be cut short in a hurricane while embarking upon a Caribbean trade mission to trade salt, wine, and liquor for tobacco to support the colony. He was to be replaced 2 years later by Mons Nilsen Kling, who oversaw 9 total expeditions to the colony between the years of 1640 and 1655. Though conditions were predictably rough, the colony thrived under his leadership and grew. Though the colony was labeled New Sweden, the majority of the population were actually Finns. This led to the melting pot of cultures within the community that included Dutch, Finns, Swedes, and Germans. There were also a number of enslaved Americans. But unique to the new Swedish colony at the time was the integral part that Native American tribes played in its success. Unlike other European colonies, New Sweden maintained relatively peaceful relations with the Lenape tribe. The Swedish adopted an integrated and economic cooperation policy with all of the various tribes in the Delaware Valley. The Swedish colonists traded tools, metal goods, and textiles. In return, they received valuable fur pelts, especially the beaver, and were taught how to hunt successfully in the New World. Fur, being one of the most profitable commodities in the global trade networks of the 1600s, became the main reason the colony prospered. New Sweden would slowly expand along both sides of the Delaware River. New forts and settlements would appear almost overnight, but there was a massive problem. The land that New Sweden had settled on was already claimed by another European power. That European power being the Dutch. And the Dutch weren't too happy that their natural geographic rival in Europe was seemingly haunting their colonial possessions across the Atlantic Ocean. So plans were put in motion to cede the territory first peacefully, and then through a series of border skirmishes. A series of successive governors in New Sweden would try to put the impasse behind both of the cultures. Unfortunately, this wasn't meant to be. The Dutch were coming. Unfortunately, the Dutch colony of New Netherlands stretched across much of the same region. The Dutch, perhaps rightfully so, believed that the Swedish colony had illegally occupied their territory. For years, tensions simmered between the two colonies as small border disputes grew into full-blown skirmishes. Governors argued, merchants competed for trade, and finally forts were built to control the river. And as each new fort was built, so too did the tensions among both populations build. Perhaps the most important Swedish defense was Fort Nya Älvsborg, built along the Delaware River. But the colony still remained small and poorly defended due to conflict with both Denmark and Norway on the European continent. Though Sweden was at the height of its power during this time period, the empire was stretched too thin both militarily and economically. It was extremely expensive to maintain such a large standing force, and though the colonial possessions in America were important for Swedish prestige, they weren't exactly the most economically prosperous of Sweden's mighty and growing empire. To make matters worse, Christina's extravagance after the death of Gustavus Adolphus did little to bolster measures to send more resources to the colony to build further, much less expand operations. After her death in 1654, the financial mismanagement hit critical points, and her predecessor was left with a mess that he couldn't hope to recover from. Meanwhile, the Dutch colony to the north continued to grow stronger. More and more Dutch were coming to America with a fresh hatred of the Swedes, who were subjugating their cities on the European continent. In 1655, the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, decided to take action. He assembled a fleet of ships and soldiers and sailed south towards New Sweden. The Swedish settlements had little chance of resisting. Within weeks, the Dutch had captured the extensive line of forts and forced the colony to surrender. The Swedes, having neither the time nor resources to mount any formal defense, instead accepted integration into the New World possessions of the Dutch. And, after roughly 17 years, New Sweden had come to an end. However, the Swedish story in America doesn't just end there. The Dutch allowed the Swedish and Finnish settlers to remain in the region. They were allowed to keep their land, they were allowed to practice their religion, and they continued farming and expanding along the Delaware River. Even when the English would later conquer the Dutch colonies, these communities remained strong. Swedish churches were built, Swedish traditions continued, and for generations, Swedish culture remained part of life in the Delaware Valley and still does in the architecture and cultural makeup of its modern-day communities. Today, the colony of New Sweden is mostly forgotten. It is rarely mentioned in historical documents or books. Lasting less than 2 decades, it never grew large and was overshadowed by a much larger European colony nearby. But its influence remains. Their settlements helped shape the development of the Delaware Valley, and their descendants still live in the region today. Small traces of Swedish heritage remain scattered across Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Churches, historical sites, and names. All reminders of a little-known chapter in early American history. New Sweden.